Hello and good morning, everybody. How you doing? This is Jeremiah, and we are having a webinar. If you are like me and you are a flat earther, believe the world is flat, this is a perfect webinar for you. We're talking about grading it flat. Got a lot to show, so do make sure you take this time to figure out where that Q&A button is so you can get your questions answered. That's what the Q and the A stand for. Type in your questions there as we move along, but be sure you get that little question box organized right. And speaking of organization, at the top of your screen, there's a little view options. I like to see where I can hit exit full screen in case I need to get to something else on my screen during the webinar. But other than that, we got a lot of really cool stuff to go over. I see a good number of people here, so we should have some great questions. So sit back, strap yourself in, and I'll get this handed over to Amanda.
Thank you, Jeremiah, and welcome everybody. As Jeremiah mentioned, my name is Amanda Berry. I'm a licensed landscape architect out of the Toronto area in Canada, and through my experience working in private practice, I had to do a lot of grading plans. So not all grading plans are the same. I used and became very proficient in Civil 3D, and I'll admit that not every project needed it as well, and we'll be going through that today. I worked on a range of plan sizes from small parks or backyards in environmentally sensitive locations to large parks or school sites, needing full cut and fill plans with the catch basins like this site, lots of sloping areas, and this site as well, lots of street presence in sloping areas. All of these needed cut and fill in order to go through the site plan design and construction phase. And that's what we're going to cover a lot of we're just going to cover a lot of the basic tools and techniques to use and in which situations they'll be useful. So it doesn't always require civil, but sometimes it really does. We're staying in CAD today. If you'd like to check out techniques going into SketchUp, we have a great SketchUp series going on that Jake's hosting next week. And the first intermediate webinar is actually the one coming up next week, but you can catch all of the recordings that we have so far on that on our website. So with that, here's what we're going through, and it might not mean much right now if you haven't gone into civil yet, but let's start. Again, if you have any questions after, I'm going to hold off questions until the end of the webinar because we have a lot to get through. And then if we aren't able to get to your question at the end of the webinar, you can always feel free to ask us at support. But let's hop right into it. So I'm actually staying in civil for the entire webinar today, but the first half actually doesn't need civil. Everything in the FX site ribbon can be used with FXCAD or AutoCAD with any type of land effects license installed. And the reason I'm not going to switch back and forth is because I really don't want to find out what happens if I start juggling virtual machines in the middle of a presentation. With different installations. So here we are just on the regular FX site ribbon that you know and love, and we're just going to go into some of these really basic. Some plans just need to communicate the grading design and don't need heavy analysis tools. So that's where these come in handy. We're mostly focusing on these just right here, the spot elevation and slope callout to start with. So we'll start with our spot elevation right here. And so I'm going to kind of go in, I click that point, and let's go into this plaza area. Plazas like this are probably going to be fairly flat. So this design probably won't need a lot of cut and fill analysis and heavy grading analysis. So usually when I was doing it, I would just end up using the spot elevation and slope callout tools to basically help me out with my regular bring it up a little bit above hand drafting, but I start out every grading plan with hand drafting. So to use that spot elevation tool, I clicked it. It's asking me to click the arrow point. You have some other options that we're going to go through in a little bit. But I'm just going to go ahead and snap down next to the building where I know what my elevation is going to be. It's probably going to be something like, oh, if I cancel out of here and look at some of the grades around here, let's say that finished floor elevation is probably going to be something like 319.3, we'll say. So if I go in here, spot elevation, there we go, click it down. I'm just going to type in 319.3. And I'm working in meters, but everything I'm doing, just pretend it's feet as well. It's exactly the same for feet, for inches, all of that, or even millimeters as well. Usually millimeters, I believe, grade in meters as well. You can add an abbreviation here, but for this one, we won't because I don't want it for this one, but I'll show you in some circumstances where that will come in handy. You don't necessarily need to do 0.2 or 3. And then you can choose a style. So if I click on this button, it opens up my callouts, and I have lots of styles available to choose from, so from existing and proposed styles. I tend to like this one right here, so I'm going to choose that. So I'm going to say OK, and pop that down right over in here. There we go. And I've already set my land effect scale on this drawing. You would need to do that. It would remind you before you place this if you hadn't. So that's a really easy spot elevation. And maybe I've already done a rough grading plan in here. I can actually use this to start checking those grading designs that I did on paper initially. Always recommend before you go into any of these grading tools, you do need a good understanding of grading techniques, because a lot can go wrong if you just rely on the CAD tools without any knowledge of if you didn't draft something completely correctly, it's just going to go along with the incorrect information you're giving it. So you really do need to be able to understand and recognize when a spot elevation isn't behaving like it should, or when contours aren't behaving like they should. So if I go into here and go into my spot elevation again, I can use this to maybe check my grading. So I have relative to existing, continue from last, grid placement we won't go through today. I'm just going to mostly stick with these two. So if I go continue from last, so that was the last spot elevation I placed, I tap the C key and hit enter. I get some options here for how to move this along from here. So I can go at a percentage. Maybe I need this to drain away from the building at, say, 1% slope. I can also choose a ratio here if I want. I can go down away from the building, and I can make this follow a straight line for this time. And I'll say OK, and we'll pop that up over here. And it's telling me exactly what it should be. And this is actually a good example of me not setting up this drawing entirely correctly. You'll see that it went at 3 decimal places, and that's actually tied to your units. So if I type in units, or UN for short, you'll see that my precision here on my drawing units is actually set to 3 decimal places. So I can drop that down and choose 2, which is more accurate for meters drawing. Won't change it right away, I'd have to redo it. But I'll show you that as we go along, that has fixed that in particular. This is actually non-plot. So don't worry about it being here, it's just a secondary check. When you go to plot, it won't show up. If I go over, say, to this swale, and place a spot elevation. And I'm just going to give it a really easy 100, or we'll go with what my drawing has. 320 point, we'll say 320, there we go. And I'll stick with the same style and say OK, and just put that in here. Now what I can do is actually go along this polyline as well. So I click on my spot elevation, and I'm going to go continue from last. And let's say I need to take this swale up at about a 4% slope for positive drainage going up the site. We'll say that's going up, and I'm gonna have a slope that follows a polyline, and I'm gonna place my spot elevations every 20 meters. Again, if you're in Imperial, these units will change based on the units set to your drawing. So I'll say 20 meters of horizontal distance, I want a spot elevation. I'm gonna say okay. To make this work, the spot elevation does need to be at one end of the line, and it needs to be snapped there. But we're just gonna click and let it go. And there we go. We have spot elevations. You can see it's at the right precision all the way up the slope at the end. And I can kind of finish that off over here by just going with a relative, going up at another 4%. And just go to the end here. And so you can actually use this as a check. You can use it as an initial grading and then maybe check your work as well based on what you figured out it should be. But this really, really helps with getting for paths that go up, up hills or driveways, anything like that. And then once you do this, you can also, you'll notice I had those options for 2 or 3 points. So let's actually say that at the bottom here, somewhere near the bottom here, I need a catch basin. I'm gonna go in and just grab one of my catch basin blocks from Plan Graphics, still in the FX site ribbon over here. I'm gonna go into my drainage and some area drains, grab a really quick block right here. And I'll just place that in. There we go. And maybe I need to call that out. So the first thing I'm going to do is figure out what the rim elevation is. So I'm going to go relative to existing, pick this one. I'm going to say that's about 4% up, or maybe it's even got a little bit of a down slope into here. So maybe it's 1% or 2% for drainage on grass down, follows a straight line. Let's place that in. Now I can't immediately edit that for multiple points, but what I can do is now use that as a reference. So I'm going to make another spot elevation, put it pretty much on the same point, and say, okay, so that's 319.87 is my rim elevation. And then maybe for my inverts, like say a north invert, this might be, let's say 317.50, and the south invert would be 317.00, and we'll include that point 317.00, south invert. And I'm actually going to change the style and go with something like a frame. Say okay, place that down, and I've got information on my catch basin. I can use my text tools and give that a title of, say, catch basin 1. I can also then, I'll get cancel out of that command. I can then delete anything I don't need here, that extra point, and maybe this extra little guide point if I want to. Again, these are non-plot, so that'd be fine. So that's a really powerful tool right there. And one thing I did want to mention is what happens when you try and do a continue from last on one of these, because you can use these multiple elevations for things like tops of curbs, top and bottom of curb, top and bottom of wall, and you might want to go relative to existing, R, and then enter from one of those top of curbs or bottom of curbs. And if you do that, and then maybe say 5% down, sure, and then we'll pop it over here. You can see it's going to follow the exact same naming convention, but it's only going to go off of the top elevation. And that's because usually these bottom elevations, you would want to manually calculate them anyways. But then you can also even go in here and edit anything along the way, including, say, even removing this if you want. So those are some basics on spot elevations. We can even go with slope callouts. So these are all non-plot. I can go in and do a manual slope callout that does plot. So if I just click down and maybe say that this slope has a percentage of I can even do actually a ratio. Maybe this slope has a percentage or a ratio of 2%, or we'll say 2 to 1, and say okay, and that places that down. If I were to make another one, I could then change it back to percent. As you go along, it will default to the last type you use. So I could even say that's 10% instead. And then I can also make one of these more visible in terms of the percentage. So if I go back over to this plaza, I can go and click that one and click that one, and it's going to put in a visible slope that I can move around and graphically show my grading design along the way. So as we go along, we haven't talked about too much in terms of contours usually. If it's a very easy plan like this, you might not even have contours. If you want to show contours on here, you might do a really quick trick. You would draw these manually, but you can save some time on the interpolation calculations by maybe even doing something like a spot elevation, put it in at 100. We'll just delete all of these. And then doing a continue from last and saying, putting in your minimum slope and either up or down, it doesn't matter, follow a straight line, but place spot elevations every vertical distance of 0.25 or even 0.2 and go along like that. And it will show you your interpolation distance for contours at 2%, and you can do the same thing for 33%. So that's a quick trick to now start drawing contours in this plan as well. But that's all basically just your really, really basic stuff. Again, these solutions are easy, and for many designs, they're enough. Really think before you start on which solution would be better for you. For a small plaza like this, or a simple swale grading like this, civil is honestly overkill because you probably aren't going to need cut and fill, and you'll spend way too much time setting it up without enough time benefit. Just keep in mind that for a lot of civil plans, it's probably going to take a few hours getting it right, if not over a day of work for maybe a day or two of work for a large site like this, getting it perfect, all the contours and everything. But then the time benefit comes in when you have to do a lot of edits, because edits become a lot easier in civil. So like I said, sometimes it isn't enough having just the FX site stuff. So you do need to get in civil. You might want more automation, and civil is great for this. So we're going to spend the rest of our time going over some basic techniques I've worked out over the years. So you will get the benefit from my trial and error. So we're here in civil, and the first place that we're going to look is the tool space over here. And this is your main hub of AutoCAD Civil if you haven't been here before. And you have two main areas that I used as a landscape architect doing grading. And the first one is the prospector. And the prospector is basically where all the physical objects lie, all the information on everything that is actually drawn in the plan and exists in the plan. So things like COGO points. So these aren't points like AutoCAD points, they're actually smart points. Point groups, so taking those COGO points and grouping them up, it becomes really handy when you're starting to need to, say, define a surface by a lot of different types of points, and you want to break them up between existing points or proposed points or something like that. You have your surfaces here. We'll get more into that. Alignments, we won't touch too much on this, but I did touch on alignments in my previous webinar on using civil for a BIM workflow with land effects. And then feature lines, we're definitely going to use a lot of these, sites. And then that's about all that I use for the most part. I have tried using, and when I initially started, I was told to use corridors and assemblies. But I found in my own practice that it really hasn't worked well for me for smaller, especially parks, because as soon as you get into an intersection like this or pathways like this, walkways behave a lot differently than roads in that they frequently and very quickly change widths, and the widths aren't that big, and then the intersections are very frequent and often not 90 degrees, and that becomes very complicated when using corridors and assemblies. I did spend some time trying to make like the perfect assembly, and it just wasn't worth the time or effort. I'm sure if I actually went on with it, it might have been a little better. But for those starting, just know that you really don't need to use it. And I'm going to show you what I use instead. I use grading instead. So that's Prospector. And then the other important part is settings. And settings is basically everything that you eventually make in Civil, how it looks. And everything in here is connected. So it's really important to get to know settings. That's usually where the holdup is in the learning curve on Civil, is knowing what you can manipulate in settings to get the look that you want. For instance, surface styles, I've made quite a few in here, and I've gone in and edited them to show what I want to have visible. I make sure everything's by layer, and then I will go in and for the contours, like adjust the contour interval how I want it, and especially contour smoothing. I usually always add in here, and for some reason I don't have contour smoothing on this one in particular. This one should be true, and it should be a spline curve. That's what I normally do for those ones. Get the benefit of me forgetting to do that. So I'm gonna say okay and apply that because we might use it a little later today. So that's surface styles. That's basically how surfaces end up looking. But then you have surface label styles like spot elevations, and spot elevations actually end up using other styles as well. So if you drill down into point styles, you have these point styles, so that surface label style uses that basic point style, but it'll also use the elevation O label style, elevation only label style. So as you kind of drill down, you'll find out how all the styles are connected and where you need to go. Usually if you have trouble finding any styles that you're trying to change, general multi-purpose or label styles are usually where they are, the ones that you're missing that you're trying to change. And you can start changing things like text size and information. You can really get really intricate and show exactly the information you want in these styles. You can import settings, but I won't go through that here. Just know that you need to be very careful about it. In the past, I've majorly messed up a template that way by importing styles, because it actually imported the entire drawing that I tried to bring it from and blew up the file size. So just my only note on that is be very careful when you're importing styles. Moving on from there, the other tool space that we have is our Civil home ribbon, and it looks very, very different from AutoCAD or FXCAD. It has a lot more Civil tools, and that's all in here. Your regular AutoCAD tools are just over here, and we're actually going to be using a lot of these. And this is just where you create all those things that end up getting listed in Prospector. So we're going to start on that. So the very first thing you want to do is you've probably got a survey in from a surveyor with spot elevations in here. And if you're lucky, those spot elevations came in that they gave you actually had an elevation to them. And so you can actually grab those and create an existing surface from them. So I've imported this as an XREF, and that helps me keep my information separate when I work. And then what you need to do is the very first thing you need to do is actually create that surface. So I can either create it from here. I can also create a surface from here. I like going in and just right-clicking and create a surface. There's a lot of ways to create these surfaces. This is just one that I found is really easy. So I'm going to go and call that existing. I can give it a description. You usually want to be very, very descriptive on your names and descriptions. And that's because they end up popping in here. And if you just name it surface 1, surface 2, feature line 1, feature line 2, you're going to lose track of things. It's like layer naming properly. So I might call this survey from GGG surveyors. And I even like to give it the date of when that survey was from, because I might eventually start getting more and more surveys that I might add in with different information. I choose a style for surveys. You always want to choose one of these background ones that come default with the program. Those are usually dashed and gray, and they're existing. I named some other ones as existing, so I'm actually going to choose this one so you can see more of the contours. And I'm going to say okay, and I don't need to worry about that because I'm not going to render anything. Great, so that surface is created, but I still don't see any contours, and that's because I need to actually add some definition to it. So I can open this up. I now have this existing surface, and you can see I have opportunities to put in definitions. There are a bunch of different definitions you can do. You can do a boundary, which is you basically choose a polyline. I'll show you this a little later, and you can cut off the surface so it's nice and clean, maybe to the limit of work of your drawing. Break lines are going to be your feature lines that you're going to do. They're basically like 3D polylines, but a lot more capable. You can add contours in here if you happen to have them. We're going to be adding drawing objects. You can add edits. We're going to be covering that. You can also add those point groups. So point groups are going to be COGO points, which are the civil type of points. But if you got points from a surveyor that aren't necessarily COGO points or civil points like I have here, they're just text or blocks with elevation, then you might want to use those instead. So what you can do is those would be drawing objects. So I'm going to right click and say add drawing objects. Oh, I can't do that yet because I'm actually not in there yet. So I'm actually going to go in and I am going to edit this XREF in place. This is the only time I usually edit XREFs in place is when I'm adding static information like this, because this information won't update later. And so it's okay for surveys because surveys don't really change. So I could add points, but I don't have any points. I happen to have text with elevation. If I cancel out of here, you can see I can choose that. That M text actually has an elevation. Where's that? Position Z or Z. And that elevation matches the text. And it actually has a block reference too that's also at elevation as well. But I'm going to add the text this time. So we're going to add text. Okay. And since I'm only adding text, and this is the only text in the drawing, I'm just going to go ahead and choose everything. It found all 54 points. I'm going to right click, and that got added, and you can see that survey already starting to form. So I'm going to discard the changes because I didn't actually change anything in that XREF. And now if I choose this, you've got a surface actually forming, and you can see the edges of this, and you can see the contours with the contour style that I've chosen, and it's kind of smoothed out a little bit because of the style that I've chosen. And you can actually go in here and start making changes. So usually when you first input information, and you would want to input as much information as you can. If you have contours from the surveyor and they're at elevation, definitely add them too, as well as these elevations. It gives you a lot more information to work with for cut and fills. But if I go in and change the style of this, let's go, instead of contours 0.2, I'm going to go to contours and triangle style that I have set up. I can see all of those contours and the triangles that make up this tin surface. So they're basically interpolating along those triangles in order to draw the contours. That's how Civil works with contours. So I can start adding edits to this. I can add edits. When I click on a surface, you'll see my surface context ribbon pops up with all of my surface specific tools. So I can edit the surface from here. I have a lot of options for editing. I can actually raise and lower an entire surface. I can do a lot of things. I can paste another surface in. We'll go through those two, but I can also swap edges, and I do this a lot. This is where knowing how to grade properly comes in handy, because you can look around your plan on when contours look wonky. They're doing things that landforms don't normally do, or your landform doesn't do, and you can just swap that edge, and maybe that's more of a ridge like that, and that's more of a smooth area like that. Just keep in mind, if you try and swap an edge where it can't actually hit both of the opposing points, that edge can't be swapped, and then you have to kind of do a little bit of a juggle and start kind of swapping edges around until you get the shape that's correct. For here, that looks the best, looks the smoothest, and just keep playing around with that. I usually take a little bit of time because I find it to be important for the final design, getting the right contour look on here. It gives me a bit more accuracy. So once you're done, you can just put this back onto your existing contours. I'm actually going to pop it back into 0.5 and 2.5, so it's not taking up too much images or too much kind of, what do you call it, graphics and rendering. And then I'm going to show you what you can actually do. So now that I have a surface, I can start doing things with it. I can say even, I'll show you some more edits. I can actually go in here and create another surface. And I'll call this existing subgrade, because maybe all of this kind of really comes in handy when you're trying to calculate cut and fills between different subgrades. So for a design like this, you might scrape off about 6 inches or 0.15 of topsoil off of the whole site before you start working. And then you have varying subgrades under each of your landforms, like your pathway would have a different subgrade from your patio area, from your soccer field. And you can actually get a really accurate cut and fill of your subgrade by using these surfaces and starting to compare them. So if I go in, I'm just going to give this one a no display because I don't actually need to see it. I'll say okay. And for the existing subgrade, I'm going to add a definition with an edit. And that edit is going to be to paste a surface. And so I'm going to paste into that existing subgrade my existing surface, so that the subgrade is based on the existing surface. And now I'm going to add an edit to lower the surface. And it's asking me amount to add to all elevations. Well, I can minus 0.15 meters or 6 inches from that elevation, hit enter. And that existing subgrade is now exactly the same as my existing surface, but 6 inches lower. So now I can click on surface and go to my volumes dashboard, grab a volume, call this topsoil stockpile, give it a no display because I don't want to see it. It's all going to be the same anyways. And then my base surface is going to be my existing surface, and my comparison surface is going to be my existing subgrade. And I can add a cut or fill factor because maybe about only 90% of that topsoil is going to be viable, and you'll have to get rid of 10% because it's not good to use. So you can add that contingency in here in your calculations for eventually using again in your topsoil for redistributing across the site after the edits. So you can see here I now have 7,600 worth of topsoil on site. And I mean, you could really do that with just a simple hatch or a land effects volume, but by setting it up this way, you are allowing yourself to then also set subgrades of your proposed surfaces as well in the exact same way. And you can start doing volume calculations between the two subgrades to get your total cut fill. And I use this a lot to eventually reduce my cut fill costs and ideally grade my site so that I can have as close to a net zero cut fill as possible. And it really saves the client a lot of money that way. But let's move on from here. Let's see where we are. We are on to working with the proposed surface now. So we've done the existing surface. We'll leave that alone for now. You can start seeing my surfaces piling up in here. We're going to start doing the proposed surface. So again, the first thing you want to do is create a surface. I'm going to again call this proposed. I'm going to give it a description, but not today. I'm going to go to display and I'm going to call this, I'm actually going to go with a 0.5 and 2.5 design and say okay. And say okay. And design just means it's going to be a different style for your proposed surface. So now I can start adding definitions, but I don't have any definitions to add yet. So I need to create those. I need to start creating things that I can start grading with. So the first thing I usually do is I pull in some objects. So I pulled in the edge of the soccer field through ncopy from my XREF, from my base file. I have a berm shape that I want to make in here. I have my walkways. And normally what you would do is add these in groups. So I would add these two walkways in, and then I would add my berm in, and that's so that you can name things properly. I'm going to cheat a bit in favor of time today, and I'm just going to add in, oh, not that one, these objects right here. And we're going to create these into feature lines, and feature lines are like grading lines that you can then add to a surface. So I'm going to go under feature line and I'm going to create feature lines from objects. You can eventually like create feature lines yourself, just as if you were drawing a polyline. I find it faster usually to create the polyline first and then just create a feature line from an object. So here again, you could do a name of feature next counter and it would just name each feature line, feature 1, feature 2. But I like to give this a description. So maybe it's the walkway. We're going to name them all walkway for right now in favor of time. But now that's going to be walkway 1, walkway 2. And then I would add the berm and that'd be berm 1, soccer field 1, that sort of thing. And you want to keep that next counter in because it won't let you name feature lines the same. This is the layer I want. I'm just going to keep it as defaults. You can erase existing entities or not. I am going to erase them this time, and you can assign elevations. I do want to assign elevations because otherwise these feature lines are going to come in at elevation 0. And when I try to add those to my surface, it really messes everything up. And you start getting contours all over the place. You'll see a little bit of that. So I'm going to assign elevations. And now it's asking me, okay, you chose assign elevations. What do you want to assign the elevations to? I can just choose an elevation or I can do from a surface. So I'm just going to go from existing. So it roughly matches that. And then I can kind of change my grading from there. I don't want to do this. It will put in little breakpoints all the way along as it crosses one of those, that surface's triangles. But I'm going to say okay for that. And I now have feature lines, but I still don't have a proposed surface yet. And that's because they haven't been added to it. So I'm going to go ahead and grab these feature lines. And again, I would normally add them in groups of what they actually are. But for the time being, to save time, I'm going to add them all at once. So proposed break lines, that's what these feature lines get added as. So I can add it here. Or I can, if I have feature lines all selected, I can actually just right click and choose add to surfaces break line. You can also find it up here in the context ribbon that pops up. So what surface do I want to add these to? Well, definitely not existing. I want to add these to proposed. Say okay, description, site stuff. The rest of these are fine. There we go, and we have a surface starting to be created. You can see it roughly matches that existing surface, and that's just because it doesn't have the same amount of triangles, but you can see this mess happening over here. And that is because we added this feature line right here, and if you follow that feature line, it actually falls outside of my existing surface, and I told it to go to the existing surface elevation. And there is no elevation there from the existing surface, so that point is at 0. So I can maybe start to grade this in order to fix that problem. So I can actually go set that grade from my feature line context tool, context ribbon that popped up. This is why ribbons are actually really great. Because as soon as you get into civil, you start realizing these context ribbons are amazing. They pop up exactly when you need them to. So this edit elevations box I use a lot. You also have edit geometry, so you can change the shape of a feature line, break it up, join it together, that sort of thing. But I use this edit elevations quite frequently, and this is my most used tool, the set grade slope between points. So I'm gonna grab that one. I've already grabbed it. It knows what feature line I'm using. So these triangles are all of the feature line points. So I can grab that triangle right there. And it's asking me, that's the elevation it should be. Right click to accept, go to the next one. And you actually should follow along it, because as you watch, you have to follow along it for it to understand what direction you want to go in. So I'm going to click here. It's saying, okay, the difference, the grade difference between the two is negative 367 actually percent. So maybe that should actually be about positive 5% up. So I'm going to say positive 5%, and I will right click, and it didn't update yet. And that's because my proposed surface that I created, it's telling me there are edits in here. This is not up to date. So what I can do is I can either rebuild it, or I can set it to automatically rebuild from now on. And you can choose between the two depending on how labor intensive the graphics are becoming on your computer. So I'm going to set it to automatic because it's really not that big of a plan right now. And that fixed it. That's a lot more accurate. And then what I can do is I can start, you can see actually that although the feature line goes along here, the edge of this is not. And along curves, it kind of, if I turn on my triangles, contours and triangles, you can see it's trying to break up that curve, but for the most part, it doesn't really recognize curves. So what I would do is actually go into this feature line and start inserting elevation points along it. I could also insert additional of these triangle PI points, but I can grab that one, and it's going to interpolate that elevation along the length between these 2 points. So I'm just going to accept it for now. And you can see the whole surface now starting to add that information and change its triangles to react to that. So that's really powerful. I can now grade between all of those points in maybe 5% up to here, and then the rest is 3%. So that gives you a lot of options in terms of grading. Then what I can also do is start grading entire areas. So you can see this is kind of cross-sloping right now. And maybe I want this soccer field to be more crown sloped for positive drainage across it. I can actually start looking at what this is doing right now by using some annotations. So I can go over to annotations, and you can click add labels. I like to just click the little tab and bring up this window and move myself over to surface. And I have a lot of different surface information that I can put in here. So I can go ahead and grab some spot elevations, choose my style, elevation only, that looks great. And I start to add it. The first thing it asks is choose a surface. So I choose that surface. And now I can snap to points, or I can just start placing things around to see, maybe even like up here and here. And I really should snap, but we're going quick today. And now you can see, okay, so that's about that elevation, and that's about that elevation, and maybe based on my original grading of the area, my draft grading by hand of the area, I determined that this is going to be my critical elevation, and this point or this point needs to match. We'll say this point needs to match here. I can't grade much further up from this road that might be existing. So I can grab that point here. And so this one's going to stay the same, or I can even elevate it from over here. I can then go and we're going to just start adding some points. So I'm going to insert PI point, and I've set up my snaps for, if I turn on my object snaps, I've set them up, or I haven't. Let's add those in. I'm going to set up for midpoint because I'm going to choose a lot of midpoints. We're going to add one here. We're going to accept that elevation for now, and we're going to add one here, and we're going to add one here, and we're going to add one right here. So you can see I'm starting to get triangles inside here. And before I start grading, I want to actually swap those triangles because I want this to be crowned. So I can go ahead and edit that surface and swap that edge. Crown that soccer field. Okay, and now let's start actually grading this feature line. So I can go in here. This is my critical point. I'm going to grade along and say, okay, from here, accept that elevation, along to here, that's going to be 0. They're going to be even because I want a perfect crown. And then I can go ahead and continue. I'm going to click here and click here, and that's going to be up 1%. So 1% crown, maybe you can, that obviously would adjust based on how good of drainage you have under this soccer field. And now I can continue going along. So here to down here is going to be -1%. And there's lots of different ways that you can continue, but I'm going to just go along here. That's also -1%. And then up to here, and I'm using right click a lot to select enter. Oops, that one, that's 1%. Okay, and now you can see we're starting to get the right contour shape that I want for this soccer field. And I can add some additional labels on here of my surface and maybe, yep, some slope and percent as opposed to rise over run. I'm going to add that, choose my surface, and I can click. It's going to ask if I want 1 point or 2 point. I'm going to just do 1 point for now and just click them down. And these are going to rotate in the direction of the water flow and tell me exactly what slope I have on this soccer field. So now I can start even adjusting things and playing around with my design to maybe get better cut fill calculations, get a better slope on this soccer field, and get the design I want. And now that that's in, I can now even move this entire soccer field up and down. Maybe I was wrong with that critical point. The whole thing needs to go up. I can grab this raise lower by reference, and maybe it needs to be from this reference. Oh, that elevation is 0. I don't want that reference. We'll say this reference. That elevation is 0. It's picking up the 0 elevation of the line from the what do you call it, XREF. So I'm going to go with the contour that I know has an elevation. So you can see the elevation down here. I'm going to reference it to that point, not that one. And maybe this, right now it's 10% lower than this point. Maybe it should be even with that point, 0. I can pull up the entire soccer field. The last kind of technique I wanted to show was, or 2 techniques. One is my technique of grading berms. this is how I usually do it. I actually outline the shape of the berm roughly that I want, and we'll kind of discuss it a little bit. But then what I do is I grab a polyline. Oh, I'm gonna get out of here. There we go. I just draw a polyline in here, snap, and then kind of add a bunch of points. You might, sometimes I even like offset this feature line in, depending on the kind of shape I want. Maybe I do actually want that really crowned shape at the top. You can do a lot of techniques with this, but this is one that I use, and we're gonna go to the home ribbon. We're gonna go feature line, create from objects. I'm gonna do a bad thing and not name that one. No, I'm not. I'm too OCD for that. Berm. Erase existing entities, yes. From surface, yes. From proposed. Okay. Grab that, add it to the surface, add it to proposed, yes. Berm. There we go. I'm starting to add some triangles in here. I can now say, pop that up a bit. I can grade along here and make this a gradual lift of say 10%. And then gradually back down and just accept the natural fall it does down to that elevation. Oh, I did it from the wrong point. It's really easy to change. There we go. Things are starting to look good. I might bump the whole thing up based on that point to that point, give it another 5% lift of the whole thing. And now what I can do is I can start swapping these contours around to smooth this entire look out. It looks really bumpy right now. As you start swapping more and more contours, you'll start to figure out the pattern it takes to get something that looks a lot more smooth and exactly what you want. So they usually have to all start going in the same direction, especially on a berm. Last technique I want to show is how I grade walkways like this. And I actually use grading tools. So you select the feature line first, you grab your grading tool that comes up in here, if I can find it. Let me see, just not seeing it. There we go, grading, it was always there. Grading creation tools, pop that up. And I need to create a new grading item to begin with. New grading item, new grading group, sorry. We'll call this walkway. Add a description if you want. You can create a surface. It does come in handy sometimes. I don't need it for this particular instance. I'm gonna say, okay, select a feature, just this one. That's great. Now it's asking me, okay, which side of this feature do you want to grade on? I want to grade on this side. Apply to the entire length. Well, it looks like the edge of that walkway is about the same length the entire way. So yes, apply to the entire length. Specify distance. So I just need to basically snap to this line, and that's the distance. Now it's asking me what slope or grade I want. I actually want grade. Grade is percentage, and that's what I normally deal with. So I just want, say, a 1% slope down. So for down is negative, and I want to slope down from the soccer field. And I'm going to make a cross slope on this. And so that's added in, but it's not added to the surface yet. I'm going to do the other side first. I'm going to grade to this side and apply to the entire length. No, not really, because the length kind of changes as you go along it. And actually, if this were to go a little further, I might want to just apply it to this area. So I'm going to say no for now. And it wants me to select the start point. And as I kind of go along here, I'm going to turn off snap so you can see it. It's showing me the arrow. So it's showing you the direction of the start of this feature line. Feature lines always have start and end points. So maybe I'm just grading from this point, except that station, all the way to the end. Just go there. accept that station, specify the distance. The distance is going to be perfect. And then it's asked me for the grade, and so that's going to be 1%. There. So I've just graded along this way, and then you can kind of grade in here. And if you can kind of see what I'm doing, this feature line, I do the exact same thing, but the important part about grading groups is you do not want them to intersect each other ever. It causes problems, especially with graphics performance. So you usually want the intersections to just miss each other. So what I can now do is what this did was it added these feature lines that are now dynamically linked to this middle center line. So I can start changing the center line of my path and it will change the edges. And I've just set how I want this path to grade across it, whether I want it crowned or I want it crossed. So now I can add those to the surface, proposed surface, walkway, 2. There we go. And I have this perfect cross-sloped walkway that I can start changing the grade of this walkway from here, say, to here. Instead of 1% down, maybe that's 5% down. And you can start seeing the changes already. Once you have these changes, again, you can make those copies of this area. You can start applying edits, like popping them down to the subgrade, and you can start stitching multiple surfaces together. So you can start creating multiple subgrade surfaces that are just a particular area. For instance, I can grab, I'm going to do just a rectangle over, sure, why not, over just this area. And I just want to capture the subgrade of the soccer field in a particular instance. I can go to my proposed grade and add a definition of a boundary. Okay, and we're going to add this guy. Oh, that didn't quite work because I put that inside it. So I can actually remove that boundary, delete that. Okay, it comes back. Easy to fix. There we go. Add a boundary. Grab this line. It's not working quite well. Oh, that's right. When I was adding that boundary, I was skipping a step. I set it to hide and not outer. I should have set that to outer. But now you can see what you can do actually for a building if you want to take the contours out from a building. That is about all I can cover today. It's a big topic. These are some of the basic grading techniques that we have. If you want to look at some things like creating a section from an alignment of this, go check out that Civil BIM workflow webinar. If you want to look at how to now start calculating more cut and fills and visualize that on this plan, again, I went over that in my Civil BIM workflow webinar. The recording is on our website. And yeah, you should just use Civil to get accurate cut and fills. And especially on large sites where drawing contours are extremely long and sites that could undergo a lot of changes or edits, or you really want to get it right. That's really when Civil becomes powerful. In all of the more simple cases though, just having those simple spot elevation and slope tools will really take you a long way and save you time and money. So let's see if we have any time to fit in any questions at the end. I really appreciate all of you guys sticking through to the end. And if we don't get to any of your questions, you can always ask it to us afterwards.
Well, we got a couple super quick questions.
Sure.
I think we can answer. Sarman was wondering, once you've created your surface here, is there a way to export that over to Rhino?
I will say that so far the techniques that I've tried while I'm learning Rhino have been going through SketchUp, and so my Civil 3D webinar of the BIM workflow with Land Effects webinar, I actually at the very end of that show how to transform this surface into just 3D triangles and then export that. And so that would probably work with Rhino, although from my initial experiments, I'm seeing a problem with those surfaces, so I'm still figuring out the right technique to go over to Rhino. I am absolutely sure, though, that there are multiple sources on Google that would definitely already go through those. I just haven't looked through them yet.
Perfect. And then one last question. Stephen was just saying, he uses Civil 3D quite a bit, and he was wondering if there's a way to use the land effect spot elevations as points in creating the Civil 3D surface.
Let me see if we added that in, Jer. No, these do not have a Z or Z position. I believe that is on the wish list, if I'm not wrong. It's already on the wish list to add an elevation to that spot in order to eventually use it. But in order to quickly add it in, you would need that spot. However, it's really easy to just add your own spots. Like, for instance, you might have gotten a survey that's in a PDF even. So you can actually go and under your points, just go under point creation tools and just add COGO points in. It's really, really simple. Play around with that tool and just pop them in on the spot elevations on a PDF that you imported. And you can very quickly, I actually created with those COGO points, this entire spot elevation survey myself. Spoiler alert, it's not a real place. With those COGO points and then just exploded them and they had that 3D elevation, but you could also add them in as COGO points too and get a lot of benefit from that. And then I remember there was one other question of how do I get that tool space? If you lose it, it's up here in the home ribbon and you can get it right back.
And that will wrap us up. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you.